I'm Larry Cohen, the president of the Communication Workers. Great to be here with all of you. President Trumpka, due to illness, could not be here this morning, so I'm going to kick this off. And it's great to be here with our wonderful Congressman George Miller from California, a champion for workers' rights around the world, and my sisters and brothers from the Colombian trade union movement. Our message today is very simple. Now is not the time to proceed with the Colombian Free Trade Agreement. It's not the time to proceed. Nothing has changed in Colombia despite the efforts of our government working with President Santos to develop the action plan. These sisters and brothers will tell you that in those 2 months, in fact, the killings continue, the exploitation of workers continue, the misclassification of workers continues. We released today a report on Telefonica, one of the largest employers in Colombia. You should all have it. If you don't, we'll pass it out. And we met with the management of Telefonica, both in Bogota and in Madrid, and they told us they've read the action plan, nothing will change. Nothing will change means that the vast majority of the 10,000 people who work for that company are not classified as workers. They're classified as cooperativos or contractors or working for a temporary agency. And there are really two issues here today. One issue is the violence, that these sisters and brothers have to exhibit bravery to be in the union movement. Now, as trade unionists in the U.S., when workers organize, workers here have to exhibit bravery about their economic career. This is true every day when workers organize in the United States. But in Colombia, the bravery is not just about their economic career. The bravery is about whether they'll get death threats, whether their families will see a death threat under their door at home, or whether they'll get shot as a motorcycle drives by and with an automatic weapon blows my brains out. This is happening right now in Colombia. Every week, another trade unionist continues to be killed, even after the action plan was implemented. So we have two issues. What kind of a world is it going to be for workers? What kind of economy do we want? That people who are workers should be classified as workers, have bargaining rights as workers, have a say at the table as workers. Whether they're in Colombia or the United States, both countries are sinking, not rising. In other nations, workers' rights are rising. Here, our rights are under attack, public and private sector, and the same is true in Colombia, where the rights are even worse, and the percentage that have bargaining coverage is even worse. So now to introduce the sisters and brothers from Colombia, I'm going to turn this over to Jeff Vogt, Assistant Director of International Affairs at the AFL-CIO. Jeff.
Thank you for being here today. I want to first have two speakers from the Colombian trade union movement. First will be Jose Diogenes Orjuela, a trade union activist and teacher for over 25 years. Diogenes is now on the executive committee of the CUT. It is the Central Unitaria de Trabajadores, the largest labor confederation in Colombia, and is now the international director. So I'll turn it over to him for his remarks.
Buenos días, soy Diógenes Orjuela. Soy el director de Relaciones Internacionales de la Central Unitaria de Trabajadores de Colombia.
Good morning, I'm Diógenes Orjuela, and I am the director of the International Relations Department.
Louder, please. Vengo a decirles que ese plan de acción firmado por el presidente Santos y el presidente Obama solamente es un truco del gobierno colombiano para que el Congreso de los Estados Unidos ratifique el tratado.
I'm here to tell you that the action plan signed by President Obama and President Santos is nothing more than a trick by the Colombian government to convince the United States Congress to ratify the Free Trade Agreement.
Con ese plan de acción no va a cesar la violencia contra los sindicalistas colombianos.
This action plan is not going to put an end to violence against Colombian trade unionists.
Con ese plan de acción no van a dejar de despedir trabajadores por crear sindicatos.
This action plan is not going to stop them from firing workers for trying to organize trade unions.
10 sindicalistas han sido asesinados en el presente año.
10 trade unionists have been murdered this year.
5 sindicalistas después de firmado el plan de acción.
5 of them after the action plan was signed.
4 de ellos son profesores al servicio de la niñez colombiana.
4 of them are teachers serving Colombian children.
3 de los 6 compañeros que están conmigo en Washington han tenido diferentes tipos de amenazas y no están protegidos.
3 of the 6 people who are here with me in this delegation have been threatened and have not received protection.
Yo no estoy protegido en Colombia. Colombia, a pesar que la mitad de mi comité ejecutivo de la Central Unitaria de Trabajadores ha venido pidiendo protección para todos sus ejecutivos.
I don't have protection, even though half of the executive committee of the unitary workers of Colombia Central have asked for protection for its executive committee.
Los empresarios se niegan a terminar las cooperativas de trabajo asociado.
The companies have refused to put an end to the associative labor cooperatives.
Los empresarios se siguen negando a negociar los pactos con los contratos colectivos con los trabajadores.
Companies continue to refuse to enter into collective bargaining with their workers.
Seguimos teniendo trabajadores despedidos porque intentan fundar el sindicato.
We continue to have workers fired for just trying to organize a union.
El gobierno norteamericano y el Congreso norteamericano no pueden dejarse engañar del gobierno colombiano.
The United States government and the United States Congress should not be deceived by the Colombian government.
Ese plan de acción necesita bastante tiempo para que lo vigilen y poder garantizar de que cambien las costumbres antisindicales en Colombia.
This action plan needs to be monitored for quite a long period of time to make sure that it brings about real changes for Colombian workers.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure now to introduce Johnson Torres Ortiz. Mr. Torres is the treasurer of his union, Sinal Corteros. He is a union of sugarcane cutters in Colombia. Fortunately, the workers in the sugarcane industry are all hired in by cooperatives, which means they essentially have no collective rights as workers. But despite this, this union has fought very hard to improve the conditions of work on the job, and Mr. Torres has been instrumental in leading that charge.
Ni el plan de acción ni las normas que han expedido por este acuerdo no los han discutido con nosotros los trabajadores colombianos representados a través de nuestras centrales.
This action plan and other laws that have been enacted by the Colombian government have not been previously discussed with Colombian workers and with our centrals.
El plan de acción lo consideramos una carta de intención del gobierno para lograr la ratificación del tratado.
We consider this action plan a letter of intent from the Colombian government to get the United States to sign this, to ratify this treaty.
Pero al igual que el acuerdo tripartito firmado ante la Organización Internacional del Trabajo en el año 2006, no se ha cumplido en la práctica.
But just like the tripartite agreement that was signed before the International Labor Organization in 2006, it has not been put into practice.
Por esta y otras razones, pensamos que el gobierno y el Congreso norteamericano debe vigilar y evaluar su ejecución.
And for this and many other reasons, we believe that the United States government and the U.S. Congress should monitor compliance with it.
Por lo menos durante 2 años antes de que tramite su ratificación.
And this evaluation and monitoring should continue for at least 2 years before proceeding with ratification of the FTA.
Algunos ejemplos. Los trabajadores de Palma del Cesar duraron hasta esta semana 2 meses de huelga por negarse a discutir el tema de acabar las cooperativas.
Just to give you an example, the palm workers in Cesar have been on strike for 2 months, and they have refused to discuss directly with the workers.
La Philip Morris despidió a 9 sindicalizados el 13 de mayo.
Philip Morris fired 9 workers on May 13th.
Se despidieron los trabajadores de Colsubsidios por crear una organización sindical.
Workers in Consubsidios were fired for trying to organize a trade union.
En enero, Central Castilla despidió 5 corteros de la comisión negociadora, la cual 3 son afiliados a nuestro sindicato.
In January, Castilla fired 5 cutters, and 3 of them were a member of our union.
Finalmente, el gobierno reglamentó el decreto 2025 del pasado 8 de junio para vigilar las cooperativas.
Finally, the government enacted a regulation 2025 on June 8th to monitor the cooperatives,
dejando abierta y permitiendo otras formas de intermediación laboral.
leaving open other forms of labor intermediation to continue.
Ejemplo, contratistas,
such as subcontracting,
sociedades anónimas simplificadas,
what are called simplified companies,
bolsas de empleo y agencias de empleo temporales.
labor or job exchanges, and temporary agencies.
Por esas y otras razones creemos que no se puede firmar ese acuerdo porque no hay garantías y no hay incrementos en la confianza de los trabajadores colombianos en esta lucha. Muchas gracias.
And for this reason, we think that this free trade agreement should not be ratified because there is no confidence among the workers in it, and this trust is not increased at all. Thank you very much.
Now we'll hear from Congressman Miller, who, as I said earlier, has been at our side, working globally and in the U.S. for workers' rights.
Thank you, President Cohn, and thank you for your support in our efforts to defeat this trade agreement. And I want to thank our colleagues and our workers and union members and leaders from Colombia in joining us here in Washington, D.C. to talk to the administration, to talk to members of Congress about the failure of this trade agreement, not only to protect their right to bargain and to bargain directly with their employers, but to protect their safety, their lives, the lives of their families and their members and their co-workers who seek to organize to better their economic situation, to better their conditions at work. The trade agreement and the action plan are a step forward. The action plan has very good words. It just doesn't work very well on the ground in Colombia. There's no evidence that it's having an impact. The violence, the threats, the intimidation, the assassinations, the murders all continue as we are here today. They continue in Colombia this year and last year. The union killings are representative of almost half of the killings of union members and their families and their leaders around the world. Half of those have been in Colombia. This is something that the Congress of the United States cannot ignore, it cannot turn away from. And before we give American preference to another country for trade arrangements with the United States, we have to ask whether or not this is good for American workers and whether or not this represents American values. And the Colombia Free Trade Agreement does neither. It does neither. And you know, when American workers are struggling now, we see that the wages of American middle-class workers in this country are plummeting. And as they struggle to organize and to maintain their jobs, they can compete with any other workers in the rest of the world, whether it's in agriculture or manufacturing. But when the other workers in the world are prevented from improving their situation because they're met with death squads and assassinations and the army and the police when they try to organize, we can't compete against that. We can't compete against that because that reduces their ability to organize and to keep their wages. And so we have to understand that this agreement is with a country, with a government, with two administrations in succession here, where the violence has been allowed to continue. The protection for these workers has not been delivered as promised. Their ability to negotiate directly with their employers has not been delivered as promised. All kinds of subterfuge, fraudulent arrangements have been entered into to avoid these people to be able to negotiate directly for themselves and their colleagues at work to improve their wages, to improve that. How is that enforced? It's enforced by the violence. I've had the opportunity to meet with these brave labor leaders here in Washington, D.C. I've met with their colleagues in Bogota. I've met with the families, the sons and daughters of people who have been killed because their parents chose to speak out on behalf of other workers, on behalf of their communities, on behalf of their local economies. And this trade agreement ratifies all of that behavior. And this administration should not be part of that, and this Congress cannot be part of that. We cannot ratify the violence against the workers in Colombia, the violence against organizers in Colombia. But so far, there's been no demonstration, and the demand here is that we have a period of time to verify whether or not the action plan is working on behalf of workers and their safety and stopping the violence against them simply because they want to participate in the working place in which they're employed. That's why the violence comes. Until we can verify that that is stopped, we should not go forward with this agreement. We should think about President Reagan when he was dealing with arms control and the Russians. He said, trust but verify. That's what we want here. We trust the words of the action agreement. We want a verification on the ground that it's working on behalf of these workers and their families and their chances to participate in the Colombian economy with the free trade agreement with the United States of America. But that's not the situation today, and that's why we can't go forward. We cannot sign this agreement. We cannot send this agreement to the Congress because it just doesn't reflect American values. This agreement between this administration and the Colombian government is an insult to Colombian workers, it's an insult to American workers, and it's an insult to American values, and it should not be ratified by the Congress of the United States. Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman. And now, consecutively, we'll hear from Congressman Johnson from Georgia and Congresswoman Sanchez from California.
Thank you, President Khan, and thank you all, you bold and courageous workers who are here today to shed some light on a situation that remains in darkness for many people around the world that just simply don't know about it. But I would ask you to, for 1 second, imagine yourself as a union organizer in the great state of Wisconsin at the current time. And I would want you to further imagine yourself under attack, physical attack, by right-wing paramilitary groups roaming the countryside, intimidating people who are trying to organize or regain collective bargaining rights. And if you can imagine yourself as a labor leader in that kind of situation, then you perhaps may be able to feel some empathy for what these bold and courageous individuals go through year after year, month after month, day after day, moment by moment. Their safety is not guaranteed when they return to Colombia. That's just the bottom line of it. And even while our workers are here in America fighting the assault against their right to collectively bargain, these trade unionists in Colombia are battling for their very lives. The situation is even more dramatic for Afro-Colombian workers who continue to face institutional discrimination, suffer from extreme poverty, and are denied basic rights and services. In addition to discrimination and low pay, Afro-Colombian workers lack the fundamental right to organize and collectively bargain, as they are often forced to work under the model of associative labor cooperatives, or CTAs, basically private subcontractors who are put in place to enable the multinational corporations to employ people and not be on the hook to give them basic labor rights, like the right to get paid in a timely way. Can you imagine going to work 1 week, expecting to get paid at the end of that week, and being told that we couldn't get it together, we'll pay you shortly, and then you're intimidated into continuing to work, and you're also under economic, you put an investment in there, you want to get your money, so you work for a couple of weeks before you are graced with a paycheck. And it may not reflect all of the overtime that you've been forced to do. You certainly can't look at any minimum wage situation under that scenario. And so these are the particular issues that affect the Afro-Colombian labor force in particular. And this is a scheme that is pretty much what we call, or what we can characterize as a legalized slavery system, a system of legalized slavery. And widespread informal hiring of these workers also abridges their rights to organize. So there are many techniques in place to subvert the human rights and the workers' rights that should be guaranteed to every worker. Colombia remains the world's most dangerous place to be a union leader, as a matter of fact. This year, 55% of unionist assassinations in the world have taken place in Colombia, 55%. And in recent months, Afro-Colombian organizations have reported an escalation of attacks against their leaders who advocate for human and workers' rights. Most of the attacks against Afro-Colombian labor activists continue with impunity. Last week, Afro-Colombian leader Ana Fabricia Cordoba was assassinated in Medellin. Violence against workers, activists, and advocates of human and labor rights, this violence must end. In this context, the pending U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement should not be ratified until the government of Colombia demonstrates that progress has been made to protect rights of Afro-Colombians, indigenous and unionists, and to effectively prosecute the attacks against their fallen leaders. America is better than that. That's why several of my colleagues and I are sending a letter to President Obama to express our deep concern for the rights of Colombia's Afro-descendants and indigenous populations, and to affirm the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement should not be approved until stronger and more credible action to protect workers and Afro-Colombians' rights are not only made, but made consistently. And with that, I will yield to my colleague from California, Linda Sanchez.
Well, thank you, Mr. Johnson, for being here today and for standing with the rights of Colombian workers. I'm honored to be here with my labor brothers and sisters this morning. And like my two colleagues previously, it's hard for me to understand why Congress is even considering this Bush administration negotiated trade agreement with Colombia. Now is not the time for the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Congress should be focused on creating jobs, and this trade agreement doesn't pass the smell test. Although the Colombia FTA does really stink when it comes to who benefits from ratification. When the U.S. International Trade Commission doesn't predict that a free trade agreement would create jobs here, you know that there's something wrong with the agreement. As a member of Congress, I've had the privilege to travel to Colombia several times to see the working conditions there firsthand. We can't afford to approve an FTA with a nation that's as unsafe as Colombia, which can't even enforce its own laws. While I was glad that the Obama administration negotiated a labor action plan with the Colombian government to address some of the concerns regarding human and labor rights for workers, this plan is just that. It's only a plan. What remains to be seen is the implementation and the enforcement. You can have the most beautiful plan in the world, but if there's no enforcement and there's no sticking to the plan, they're just pretty words on a piece of paper. The administration says that the labor action plan has been met, but we know that it doesn't go nearly far enough. Beyond that, the Colombia FTA really benefits transnational corporations. These transnational corporations already repress Colombian workers. Nothing gets better for Colombian workers. They don't get an equal share of the benefits that this free trade agreement could bestow. As a moral imperative, as Americans, do we really want to say we want to do business with people who behave this way? Irresponsible behavior should not be rewarded. We have something that Colombia wants. They want free trade with the United States. They want trade preferences that don't expire. And as a matter of moral uprightness, we need to hold them accountable for what happens within their borders. I simply don't get why we're rushing to try to approve a trade agreement that most Colombian workers don't even want. Many of my colleagues in Congress, they try to overlook the working conditions that a foreign company could create and that exist currently in Colombia. And quite frankly, in addition to the moral argument here that this is just plain wrong, there's an economic argument, a very real economic impact to workers here in the United States. When workers here in the United States have to compete with workers in foreign countries that are not even allowed basics like minimum wage or overtime pay, nor even the rights to associate together to try to form a body that could represent their interests, that could collectively bargain for a better lifestyle. When American workers have to compete against those workers, what do you think happens to American workers' wages and financial securities? When corporations can simply pick up and move to other countries where workers can't stand up for themselves against uncertain paychecks or minimum wage or no overtime pay, how do you think American workers can compete with the wages and conditions in those countries? There is no freedom there for these workers, as you've heard. They've been attacked, they've been killed. Their lives, very lives are at risk every time they seek to try to open their mouths to improve their economic condition and their economic certainty. Without that, there is no fair competition for American workers. Without fair competition, we'll see even more American jobs shipped overseas. And that's the absolute last thing that our country needs right now. That's why I and my colleagues are here to stand in solidarity with these Colombian workers and to fight tooth and nail against the Colombian Free Trade Agreement. Thank you so much for your interest and for being here today.
Thank you, members of Congress. Now we can take questions. Yeah.
What's been the reception so far, bringing this delegation around, and maybe I'd pose it to them too, what's been the reception of members of Congress, especially some who maybe are on the fence? Congressman Levin particularly, it seems unclear whether he will support. So what's been the reception of this demand that you delay it for 1 or for 2 years in order to see progress?
We're not necessarily saying 1 or 2 years. We're saying we want to see some results that indicate change in Colombia on the ground. The action plan is better than nothing in terms of the words, but if there's no results for the 18 million adults who work in Colombia, it's a large country, there's no results that can be demonstrated. And when large companies like Telefonica say we will change nothing in terms of almost their entire workforce doesn't have employment rights, that's the reason we're saying wait for as long as it takes to demonstrate results. But I think in terms of your first question, there's a good reception in terms of the meetings that they've done. If one of the sisters or brothers wants to comment on that, they represent a wide range from teachers to the energy sector, to the agricultural sector, and transportation. And I think there's, the visit is very important in that way. I can't speak for Congressman Levin or any other member, but I think that the members of Congress are listening. I don't know if the members want to answer that about the reception, or we'll just leave it at that. It's up to you.
It's really a process of education and educating our colleagues about the conditions in Colombia. Some have not traveled there. Some have traveled there on congressional delegations that are meant to only show them one side of what goes on in Colombia. And for members who have actually been there on their own dime or with other groups that seek to show us the very nitty-gritty reality of what workers confront there, it's our duty to bring workers themselves to talk about their own individual experiences and to sort of piggyback on that and talk about what we've seen and experienced there, because official trips don't always show you both sides of the story. And it is persuasive in many cases for members that are uncertain. The opportunity to actually ask questions of workers and get responses from the actual workers themselves, not official statements, not people who purport to speak on their behalf, but from the actual workers that are impacted. So we'll continue those series of meetings and visits with our colleagues to try to help them understand exactly what is at stake for the workers there and for our workers here if this trade agreement should come up for ratification.
If the trade agreement to be voted today, what will be your estimate on the vote favor?
I don't know, have an idea?
I think that the importance is that we're here today to try to bring that kind of education that obviously has to occur before there are any votes. Even with fast track, you don't just vote, and we're trying to bring out this side of it. Obviously it has support. What we're trying to do is to show that support, A, needs to be conditioned, and B, needs to wait. That action plan, this action plan is great on paper, but the question is, when does it make a difference for these workers and 18 million of their sisters and brothers in Colombia? Other questions?
How many of your colleagues are going to sign on to the letter to President Obama?
We have yet to certainly.
Yeah, I think there are 12 people who have agreed to sign on to that letter at this point, and we're still working on others.
We send when?
We have 14 now, I'm told.
Do we send when, the letter?
Hmm?
The letter is to be sent when to the White House?
Well, we're still in the process of gathering the signatures so that we can demonstrate as much strength as we can. But it will be going within the next week or so.
Jeff, you know the answer to that?
No, I think we had a full agenda over this week. We're meeting with as many members as possible. Obviously, 20 or so, I think would be
Face to face.
yeah, face to face. No, we're talking everything.
Yes.
Is Obama administration not telling the truth when they certify that Colombia has meet the action plan?
I don't think it's about truth so much. I mean, again, the action plan reads very well. The problem is the implementation. And we're still looking for examples of where there are results that are different. When does the killing stop? When do the rights just as workers start? When do the rights to organize start? And we're looking for examples. So we say to the Department of Labor and the White House, show us the examples of results. Sisters and brothers want results, we want results. We're not against results if they're there, we want to see them.
Yeah. When will we see results with prosecutions, with investigations, prosecutions, convictions, and punishment to address the 51 murders of union activists in 2010? And I believe it's been about 51 so far this year.
2,800 altogether.
When will we see an investigation into each and every one of those murders? That's the question. When will we see prosecutions that ensue from those investigations? That's very important now. For many years, Colombia has published many papers, laws, and whatnot that manifest their intent, first of all, to recognize the rights of the Afro-Colombians and the rights to their land. And but yet, Colombia is one of the, I think the world's, well, it's one of the biggest, has one of the largest numbers of internally displaced persons on Earth. and it's largely the indigenous and the Afro-Colombian people who are being moved off of their land at gunpoint, at the point of a weapon held by a right-wing paramilitary group, some of whom are suspected to be members of the Colombian armed forces and police. And these people are being ushered off of their land so that multinational corporations can then exploit the land for whatever lies under it. And so we've had these kinds of manifestations in writing from Colombia since, what, 1993 or so, with Public Law 70, I believe it was. And but yet we see the conditions remain, and now they're getting worse. And so we need to see some results.
Yes. So yes, we have the AFL-CIO and our unions are constantly meeting with the administration here, and when possible, also in Colombia. They do listen, so this is an improvement in that sense. But again, the problem is we're not getting any results that are different. And we also say to the multinational companies, you know, don't think that Colombia is so different you can race to the bottom. Don't think that the United States is also so different that you can continue to race to the bottom. And we say to these multinationals, it's not just the government. You know, what does leadership mean? They love to talk to us about leadership, except when it comes to workers' rights in Colombia or frankly here as well. In terms of the ratification process, it's a simple majority, House and Senate. It is covered under the old, sadly, fast track from the Bush administration, so it's not amendable. So majority, House and Senate.
With the White House, how have they indicated how close they are to transiting to House representatives for those?
No, we don't know that. Correct, Bill? No, you don't, Congressman, you don't know either, correct? We don't have a date.
I don't, but I have read that the Ways and Means Committee is going to mark up the free trade agreement, I think, next week.
Okay.
With or without the transmission, they say. So it looks like someone in power is hell-bent on fast-tracking this thing.
I was wondering if you, since the three trade agreements are bundled together, are you guys doing an effort on the other two? Do you have a position on the other two agreements and you're willing to, you know, if you're against this one, if you're for the other one, or neutral?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're against bundling as the labor movement here. We think they need to be considered one at a time. And, you know, we don't believe we have a framework for trade agreements that works for American workers, as the members of Congress said. I mean, in this particular case, it's also a human rights as well as an economic issue. That we're not going to support a trade agreement in Colombia until there's a demonstration that things on the ground there have changed. But the framework of all three we have a problem with in terms of how investment works. So we're not supporting any of them. But this one we're particularly fighting because of the size of Colombia and of the lack of any workers' rights. It's not just organizing rights. They don't have rights as workers. And that trend is only getting worse. So our focus will be on this one.
Yeah, certainly, and they each should be considered on their own merits. This one has unique attributes or detriments.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it deserves the individualized attention that we are shedding upon it today.
Yes, sir.
President Cohen, your union has called for language in the implementing bill of the FTA that would somehow make the labor action plan more enforceable. Can you talk about that idea, and has that do you have actual language that you're suggesting, and how would that work exactly?
Yeah, well, I'll ask Bill or Jeff. Anyway, just come up. I'll start off. You'll figure it out. So yes, we're asking that the implementation agreement have in it that the action plan, this action plan, that it's enforceable and in a sense part of the agreement, in that it's in the implementation agreement. If that's not done, then virtually nothing can be done tied to the trade agreement. There are sanctions in the trade agreement, and nothing can be done to make it enforceable. So that is a major concern we have, in addition to no results on the ground in the 2 months since the action plan was agreed to. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, just to reemphasize that point, it's even if all the laws and decrees are put into place, again, it's whether they're being enforced in practice, and that's really what we're looking to see. Again, the action plan has some good concepts in it. We recognize it has some limitations, but more than anything, if there are no results on the ground, then they're just words on paper.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Trump promised about 2 weeks ago at the National Press Club that he was going to have a fight with the administration and with the representatives who will support this free trade agreement with Colombia. What is the price that they are expected to pay for not having your support in the next election?
Yeah, Bill, I don't know if you want to add to this. I think the point that Rich was making is that we consider this Colombia trade agreement a critical issue, and that to the extent American workers can do it, we will hold our representatives accountable if they ignore the pleas of workers in Colombia and in the United States. We're making it more as a statement that there needs to be accountability to the people across this country on what people do here, not just accountability to multinational companies and to the Chamber of Commerce. That's a big booster of this, but to the working people of this country. It's time we had accountability on these key issues, and this is a key issue for us. Okay, thank you for coming out today, and we will fight on together as sisters and brothers.